Welcome to the Dispatch Podcast. I'm Sarah Isger with Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, and y'all aren't going to believe the special guest we have today. Drum roll, please. That's right, it's Steve Kornacki, fresh from the NBC Excel spreadsheets where he lives most of the time. They've let him out of the computer. He is on the podcast. Steve Kornacki, thank you for joining us.
Sarah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I want to just start with, what are the misconceptions that you're seeing from folks out there, whether it's about polling or early vote totals or anything else, that you're like, ooh, that's not what I think is happening?
I think I look at it just a little differently, and I don't trust anybody who's confident right now. And I hear very confident and authoritative sounding analyses of early voting data, and I can listen to Democratic experts, and they could stitch together, well, look at this and look at this one, and say, wow, you got something going there. And I can hear the exact same thing from Republicans. And the question with the early vote, it just, to me, is always, are you robbing Peter to pay Paul? It's just essentially, okay, wow, the Republicans suddenly have a ton more people voting early. Are they banking votes they wouldn't have gotten, or are they just going to have that much less support on election day? And I feel like the early vote thing has really gotten kind of tied up into the specific Trump era polarization. Meaning we saw in 2020 how Republicans were very hostile to vote by mail because Trump's changed his tune. Certainly his campaign's changed its tune. And I think that just may be shaping across state lines behavior of voters in terms of what their willingness to vote early, and it may just scramble the numbers and mean we don't have a good basis for comparison. So I see a lot of early voting talk, and maybe we'll learn something after the fact, but I'm taking it with a gigantic grain of salt right now.
I'm going to turn to all of you on this, but I'll start with you, Kornacki, which is, as America just becomes so 50-50 and so polarized, but equally polarized, and response rate on polls have gone down, polling has missed now several cycles, is polling worth our time, so to speak? Like, are we done with polling as Americans? Because it's always going to be so close. The mathematical margin of error may be 3 points, but then you add in the sort of dark arts part of polling, that's going to add another point and a half, maybe. So at the point that we have a 4.5% margin of error on some of these, like, what good is that poll to me?
Right. I mean, this year has been different, obviously, just in that, it's been so tight. It wasn't in 20, it wasn't 16. In the polling, obviously, that the final result was different. But, we see averages. We have a running average at the state level. The most lopsided battleground state we have right now is 1.6 points. For Donald Trump, we have 4 of the 7 are a fraction of a point right now. I mean, I know we've talked about, we've been in sort of a 50-50 nation for a long time here, but this is kind of extreme, just at least as it goes in terms of the polling. And I think look, if we end up with a series of battleground races that are 10,000 votes, 5,000 votes, 2,000 votes, the polling will have kind of been valuable in that it really told us, wow, it's closer than ever. But you always have the possibility, these swing states pretty much have gone, in 2016, every state, but Nevada, that's a swing state now, went for Trump. In 2020. Every state that's a swing state now, except for North Carolina, went for Biden. So they usually end up kind of going one way or the other. And if you do end up with sort of a more decisive result, yeah, I think everybody's coming for the pollsters again.
Steve, is the only reason that we talk about polling because we have nothing else to talk about? Since it's not helpful?
I mean, I think there's plenty to talk about. But people obsess about the polling because it allows, to a certain extent, this, people have called this a vibes election. I hate the phrase. I do think that it's apt in some respects because it really is more about sort of how do people feel about these candidates and what do they do than it is about a sort of a hard argument over different ideological priorities. So to a certain extent, people are talking about this because that's one way to try to measure sort of vibes and the direction of the vibes. It also, I think, gives political reporters sort of an excuse if they don't understand the nuances of the policy debates. They don't really need that excuse in this cycle because it's not a policy heavy election. But I think a lot of times going back, historically, you see people sort of obsess about the polls and obsess about the horse race. Because it's fun. And I say that unapologetically. It's fun to cover. It's fun to follow. And I like to cover the campaign tactics and strategy, but also because the policy answers are harder to cover.
Jonah, polling.
Um,
What's it good for?
it's funny. I just had a conversation with Starwalt on my podcast about this. I kind of think, the Madisonian vision of the American way politics is supposed to work was that elections were actually the polling, right? That's how you would take the temperature of the people, by having constant elections in this country at every level of government. And I think that we've lost something. Not so much, I don't care about people like us following polls. It's the politicians following polls so much that they're almost always one layer of separation from what they actually believe when they're talking, because they're thinking about poll tested things. And I think you lose something when you don't have politicians willing to go out and say, this is what I believe, make a case for it, rather than trying to guess what the public already thinks about something and spinning it to fit their position. And I think that one of the look, we now know that This Is Why You Got Trump is a multi-volume book, and we could have a lot of arguments about why we got Trump. Steve wrote one of them. Or Kornacki wrote one of them, I should say. We're calling him Kornacki, not out of disrespect, to keep people from being confused with the other Steve. But one of them is that he doesn't talk like he poll tests everything. And I think there is this sort of sense among a lot of people, sort of like when you get sick of MSG and Chinese food, just when they can feel it in our politics. And then when they hear someone who says stuff that they may hate or be disgusted by or put off by, what they actually are, they're not paying as much attention to the text anymore. They're paying attention to the subtext, that here is a guy who's willing to stick it to the man. And I think that is corrosive to sort of civic health.
Steve Hayes, you had some questions for your colleague over at NBC.
Yeah, speaking of states that are narrowly divided, I'm going to ask you, because I'm from Wisconsin and I'm actually trying to report out a piece on what's happening in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was decided by 20,000 votes last time. For the last 6 elections, it's been decided by less than a point. Incredibly tight. It was the place that Kamala Harris first held an in-person event with Liz-Cheney, an obvious attempt to go after sort of disaffected Republicans, frustrated Republicans. There was a Marquette University law poll out yesterday that showed Donald Trump has 92% support among Republicans, but Kamala Harris, 7% of Republicans are telling that pollster right now that they're going to vote for Kamala Harris. It's very clear that this is part of the Harris campaign strategy to target these disaffected Republicans, these movement conservatives. And I wonder if anything that you're seeing either in the polling or as you're talking to people suggests that they're having any success at this. Are these people gettable? This will undoubtedly be, if Kamala Harris loses, one of the things that's most heavily scrutinized in the aftermath.
Yeah, I think the big question there is, you could also sort of fold in this Nikki Haley vote question, from the primaries. And how much of that Nikki Haley vote was actual Republicans, practicing Republicans, I'll put it that way, versus, how many of them are folks who had access to a Republican primary but had already voted for Joe Biden in 2020. And, because when you look at where Haley performed the best in the primaries, it's just so consistent across state lines, higher income, high concentration of college degrees, and then just falls off the cliff when you get into those, more blue collar areas. And those are the areas, obviously, where the Republicans have just bled the most support in the 2 Trump elections. And they're also the areas where you just see the most motivation outside of presidential elections to vote. These are folks in these places who will crawl over broken glass for any chance to vote against Donald Trump. So how much of that is what we saw with the Haley vote in the primary? But what they're trying to do, obviously, with the Liz-Cheney thing, look, Wisconsin well, but it's a play to build on the momentum that they already have in what you'd call the wow counties for folks who don't know Wisconsin as well as you do. The three sort of collar counties of Milwaukee, and really Ozaukee and Waukesha. Waukesha is the biggest, and those are the two that have moved. There's now Milwaukee suburbs have remained more Republican than other suburbs around the country, but they have moved pretty dramatically away from Trump. Ozaukee's the one I'm going to watch on election night to see if what you're talking about has worked, because in 2020, Joe Biden got 43% of the vote in Ozaukee County, and it has the highest concentration outside of where the University of Wisconsin is, has the highest concentration of college degrees of any county in Wisconsin. Biden got up to 43. He lost it by 12. That was the best performance by a Democrat there since Lyndon Johnson, 1964. Is that one that Democrats are actually making more progress in? Are they getting inside 5 points? If they ever win Ozaukee, I think it would say the strategy you're talking about certainly hasn't hurt, because that's the kind of movement they need in a place like that.
Well, and there was a really interesting tweet thread from Ben Wickler, who's the chairman of the head of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, about what they're doing with these Nikki Haley, Liz-Cheney voters. And he said, basically, people are misunderstanding this. It's not about going for actual undecideds. It's about getting committed Republicans, movement conservatives, Reagan conservatives, to not write somebody in, but to cast a vote for Kamala Harris. And one of the most interesting things, if you go really deep and look at the municipalities, sort of municipality by municipality in those three important counties in Wisconsin, is the shift between voters in 2016 who were willing to write somebody in or vote for a third party, and voters in 2020 who were not. And while everybody's vote share grew in 2020, there was a demonstrable shift toward Joe Biden. It seems like those people who were thinking about writing somebody in moved, and the number of people voting for third parties or writing somebody in went from 2 or 3% in those towns to 7, 8, sometimes 10%. And it seems like they're targeting that group plus some. I mean, 75,000 people voted for Nikki Haley 26 days after she dropped out. And maybe more interesting, 9,700 people voted for Chris Christie in Wisconsin 3 months after he dropped out, which is probably a purer anti-Trump vote.
Jonah?
All right. So first of all, the question that everybody really wants to know is, who would win in a fight, you or Harry Anton?
Yeah.
Well, I'm undefeated in fights because I've never been in one.
There's something very zen about that. So speaking of Harry Anton, my colleague on CNN, who I just realized I had an epiphany on air, sounds like a 1930s gangster movie mobster. I mean, like literally, see the numbers here? See, you got me, man. You hear me? It's once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. He was making the point that the average error in polls going back, I don't know what it was, 1980 or 1960 or 2000, but for a long time, is about 3.4. And the point he was making was that if that error went Harris's way, she wins in not a massive electoral landslide, but in a clear and decisive victory. If you give her 3.4 points, it's all over pretty early on election night. If you give Trump, ditto, maybe even a bigger landslide, or a bigger victory. And so the part of the question is, a probabilistic tie is not necessarily an electoral tie, right? Like, the polls are going to be wrong. We don't know if it's by a lot or a little, but it's going to be wrong. But they're probably going to be wrong in one way. And so, or are they going to be wrong in one way, right? Have people changed their models in tandem, or are their models different in a bunch of different ways? I guess the question is, do you think we're actually going to see it as tied in the returns as we see it tied in the polls?
Well, this is where I'm going to pull out the oldest cliche in election analysis, that it all comes down to turnout. But I say it in particular this year because I think that's where the potential for the polling miss, that you're talking about, a couple points in one direction or the other, comes in. because you can see with, we'll take Trump for instance. It's very clear from the polling what it depends on for his coalition to actually emerge. He has voters. A good chunk of his coalition are voters who either one of these things applies. Did not vote in the 2022 midterms. And also did not vote in the 2020 presidential election. That's his strongest group of support when you look at past voting history. Not voting in 20, not voting in 22. Trump's up double digits with those voters over Harris. Voted in both 20 and the 2022 midterms, much more engaged. Harris, that's her strongest group. She's up, I think, about 8 points over Trump with that group. Also, we ask in our poll, rate your enthusiasm 1 to 10, 10 the highest. 9 to 10 is usually our metric for these are the most sort of engaged. Obviously, Harris again 9s or 10s. Any 7 through 10 actually Harris has the advantage over Trump. 1 to 6 Trump has the big advantage over Harris. And when you look at it demographically, what's behind that is Trump's growth in the polls has come from any combination here, non-white, male, younger really kind of being under 50. Start layering those on top of each other. When you look in our poll and you see young, meaning under 50, Hispanic male, Trump's up 13 points over Harris. He's winning that demographic outright. Meanwhile, female Hispanic is Harris plus 26 over Trump. So massive gender gap there.
And they're better propensity voters, right?
Female, exactly.
Yeah, Hispanic,
it's traditionally speaking, the coalition that Harris has is more dependable than the coalition that Trump has. If he's able to pull it off and actually convert what's in the polls into support on election day, then this is a very different coalition, I think, than we've seen before, from a Republican candidate and a little bit George W. Bush 04. But that's it. And if these voters, a lot of them have not voted in the past, despite having opportunities to do so. And if they end up saying, whatever, I kind of like Trump, but there it is. There's the turnout disparity that causes the poll error that gives this to Harris.
Can you also follow up on Jonah's point of whether you think the different polling companies that have obviously they don't want to miss have adjusted their magic formulas all sort of in the same direction to account for the 2020 miss? And footnote, right? 2020 actually had a larger polling miss than 2016, except that it was still correct in terms of outcome. And so we don't think of it as being a bigger polling miss. It doesn't feel like as big a polling miss compared to 2016, where it was a relatively small miss, but it missed who the president was going to be. Are they correcting all in the same direction? Are they correcting in different ways so that we're having different formulas out there, which of course would be, I think, everyone's preference?
Yeah, no, there's variance, and I think they're all kind of the miss in 16 and 20 was so sort of demographically specific and even geographically specific. Polling in Georgia in 2020 actually wasn't that bad. Polling in Wisconsin and Michigan in 2020 was terrible. And 16, it's that miss of the blue collar white voters, that northern tier of battlegrounds where they're just a huge chunk of the population. And they were still voting Democratic until very recently. Just the extent of Trump's support there, both times not caught in the polls. Now, I'll give you an example here. We went and we talked to the folks at Quinnipiac, one of the pollsters, Quinnipiac University. They do something different than, it's old school. A lot of other pollsters have moved on from this, but they do what's called random digit dialing. They get all their callers in a room. A phone number pops up on their screen at random. They have to punch it in. There's a law they can't do the robocall, so they have to physically punch in the phone number. And it takes them. I talked to some of the folks there. It's crazy when you look at it. They said they do a 4-hour shift. In a good night, a really good night, they get 2 interviews done in 4 hours. It's considered a successful night if they get 1. And a lot of them get 0, and they just go fishing again the next day. That is what it's at. But the change that they made, and Quinnipiac had, look, they're not alone. I'm not singling them out here, but if you look back at their 2020 polls, you had some pretty substantial misses there. What they believe and what their poll director says is that they got Trump voters, this kind of Trump voter we're describing, on the phone in 2020, but that voter hesitated to say they were for Trump. Whatever reason you want to give to it, hesitated to say it. So they've added a layer this time around where when somebody's like, they're a little wishy-washy, there's a second prompt of, something to sort of say, look, if you really have to, I'm just paraphrasing here, if you really have to make a decision here, who do you think, they push him sort of like that. And he says that's where they're getting more Trumps than they've gotten in the past. And it bears out in their polling. Their polling in the past always had Trump behind pretty substantially in some cases. Their polling this year has had Trump slightly ahead in some cases, even in the others. So he thinks they've addressed it that way, but that's, there's others that have gone at it different ways.
And will you pronounce the polling company, because you're from Massachusetts, so I'm going to trust your pronunciation more than my own.
Okay.
But I've been saying, and now I'm not even sure what I've been saying. Quinnipiac? How are you saying it?
I said Quinnipiac, Connecticut, just outside New Haven. I know it from obscure college basketball games. That's how they say it on the air. But
okay, thank you. That just wanted to clear that up.
The Bobcats.
Jonah, did you?
Yeah, I mean, all right. So, but part of my question before about the error in the polling, do you think that the swing states are all going to go in one direction, or do you think that it's going to be, it's like a lot of these tie scenarios. All these tie scenarios depend on Nebraska 2. Mm-hmm. But Nebraska 2, Harris is up like 8 there. So right. Like the idea that she's, that if she loses Nebraska 2, she's lost a lot of other stuff already.
That's right.
So therefore it's not going to be a tie, right? But tie is political nerd porn. So everyone wants to talk about tie. But just generally speaking, do you think the day after the election, it's going to look more like 2000 with Florida, where it really was kind of a tie boiled down to one state? Or do you think it's going to look more like, say 2020, where actually the results were pretty clear, but they were narrow enough that there was a big fight about it?
I wish I had a good answer here, in part because I wish I had a strong hunch about that. And this is sort of the first election I can remember going into where I did not have inside a pretty clear gut feeling about where it was going. The gut feeling in the past hasn't always been right. It would have said Clinton in 2016, but generally the gut feelings matched up with what's happened. I just, there are some days when I think the kind of polling miss I just described working in Harris's favor is going to happen. There are other days when I think that blue collar white support is going to come in, on fire for Trump. And I mean, I look at all these states in 3 categories very quickly here. A state like Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania, I look at 3 categories. They've all gotten more red since Trump came along. There are portions of those states, densely populated portions, that have actually in that time gotten much more blue. So I want to measure those areas against the portions of the state that have not just gotten more red in 2016 when Trump came along, but got even more red in 2020, sort of a blue surge, red surge comparison. Is there any kind of a turnout disparity that we're seeing there? And then there's that in-between category where Trump made big gains in 2016 and gave back a little bit in 2020. And that's where these states are won and lost. We talk about Wisconsin. Tell me about Brown County, Outagamie County, Winnebago County, the Bow counties, Green Bay, Appleton, Oshkosh. Trump got up to 10-point wins in these states in 2016, came down to 5-6. Is it back up at 10? I think that's working in Trump's favor. Is it still where it was? I think that's working in Harris. But I wish I had a good answer for you. I could pick either scenario.
All right, so let's fast forward a couple days here. It's election night. What are your bellwethers?
So an early one is in that 6 o'clock hour Eastern. We get Indiana and Kentucky, or we should. We'll see how fast they are. Non-competitive states, but we've been talking about this suburban phenomenon. The earliest measure of that is Hamilton County in Indiana. Bedroom communities just north of Indianapolis, rapidly growing. And demographically, it typifies what we were describing, as that growth area for Democrats, high concentration of college degrees, higher income, all these sorts of things. And you can just see it. In 2012, Mitt Romney against Barack Obama, Hamilton County, Mitt Romney won it by 33 points. 2016, Trump comes along, down to 19. 2020, down to 7. Are the Democrats flipping Hamilton County in 2024? If they are, I think that's a very good sign. Not in Indiana, obviously, but that's a sign. There's a lot of Hamilton counties in swing states that we're going to be looking at. And we talked about Ozaukee in Wisconsin. If I see Hamilton flipping over, I know right away, I think there's a real chance here that Ozaki is going to continue that move towards Democrats. Another early one I'm going to look at, I was going to look at this anyway, but now in light of recent events, it's even more. 7 o'clock, Florida. Again, we're not expecting it to be competitive, but of all the big states, Florida is the most efficient vote counting state. So, I mean, in that first hour, we could get complete results in some of these counties in Florida. I'm going to key in on Osceola County, which is just south of Orlando. I was going to do this anyway because it's one of 3 majority Hispanic counties in Florida. And unlike, when you look at South Florida and Miami-Dade in particular, obviously heavily Hispanic too, it's a little distinct politically because of the high Cuban American population, which has a sort of a different political cast than other Hispanic subgroups. Osceola, though, and this is where I say recent events come in, 1/3 of Osceola County is Puerto Rican. It's the highest concentration of Puerto Rican voters of any county in Florida. So, and it's a place where, again, Donald Trump made double-digit gains. It was blue in 2020, but Trump improved by 11 points relative to 2016 in Osceola County. He made real gains with Hispanic voters and with Puerto Rican voters in Osceola County, and his campaign has been banking on further gains with those voters, not just in Florida, but elsewhere. So obviously, in light of all that noise this week, has he paid a price? Or is he continuing to grow in Osceola? Because his campaign, certainly prior to Sunday, would have said continuing, well, I still say now, but continuing to grow in Osceola County. So that's, I think, an early test of that.
I just want to tell listeners at this point that we didn't give Steve any of these questions in advance. He didn't get to script any of this. It certainly sounds like I don't think I heard a single or hesitation. We didn't cut anything. I know you're great. I watch you, but I will admit I'm sitting here a little bit blown away anyway. And by the way, I did bring up your Wikipedia page just to see what it says. And Jonah, I mean, it reads pretty similarly to your Wikipedia page. Here, I'll just read a sentence. Following his work on the 2020 United States presidential election, Kornacki was named by People as one of the sexiest men alive, with his use of Gap khakis eventually becoming a fashion trend on its own, colloquially referred to as Kornacki khakis. What a life, Steve Kornacki. I guess my real question out of all of this is, you now are the man for everything from NFL, the Olympics, the Kentucky Derby, and presidential elections, and midterms, of course. What is your Christmas when you have so many days to open presents and events around the year? Is this Christmas for you?
First of all, the People magazine thing was the real vote fraud in 2020. I can tell you that. But
I'm sure you've never used that line before.
No, I know. I got it ready. I was waiting for the moment there. This one, the answer is honestly is no, and it's only because I feel so much more anxiety. There's just so much more to juggle, and I always say 99% of the research. Just my desk, if you could see it here, is just filled with folders and stuff. 99% of it will never make air, and but you need to prepare because all these contingencies on election night you're never expecting. I've got a folder that just says, it's my break glass folder because we focus on the 7 battlegrounds, but what if New Hampshire gets interesting? So got to be ready for those too. And so every time I think of election night, I just think of all the different things I could possibly be hit with. And it can get overwhelming. And I guess versus like, I get to do the Kentucky Derby. It's like, it's fun. I love horse racing. So it's just, I get to live in like, horse racing for a month, and I can present the stuff that I present on air. I have rehearsed ahead of time, and I've researched, and the only thing the risk for me is when they have me make the pick, and I got one right.
You got right.
I got it.
Yeah.
But they later disqualified the horse, but I kept the money. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're not supposed to know if the horse has been taking drugs.
That's right.
If you do and you don't pick them, you got a whole other thing going on. Just a very quick question, and you don't have to name names, though. Obviously, we would prefer if you name names. Have anybody gotten from any campaign, this campaign or previous campaigns, taken your read of numbers incredibly personally, and tried to work you to like as an appeal of either intimidation or nepotism to like change your numbers, or to recant your numbers? I mean, how much working of the refs goes on behind the scenes?
You know,
not that you would ever cave to any of it. But,
yeah,
you know.
no, and I'm thinking it through, and honestly, it's like I'm thinking 2020. We had 5 days, basically a 5-day election there until Pennsylvania got called, and not a ton. There's not a ton. There wasn't, and I think there's the stuff I've gotten has been more in the pre-election period, when you're living more in I can think of a midterm election where there's something a couple years ago. But I've also we talked about polls at the start of this thing, and I think because they've been so consistent and they're so consistently narrow, I've made a conscious decision to back off a little bit. I mean, we have an NBC poll. I present all the NBC polls. We'll check in with poll averages here and there, but in the past I've lived by the here's today's new poll. What could it possibly mean? And you end up with totally contradictory narratives one day followed by, and I've backed off from that this time and just kind of accepted what I said. I don't trust confidence. I see turnout scenarios, and I'm as curious as anybody what's going to happen.
Yeah. And our colleague Chris Starwald has some stories about people trying to work him when he was at Fox, but that's another conversation.
Okay, do you know Scott Hansen over at NFL Red Zone?
I definitely know of him. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So he has this whole thing where basically he's like, I don't drink water for 6 days, so I'm fully dehydrated by the time Sunday comes around, so I won't need to take bathroom breaks. Do you have any rituals that you'll be doing on election day that we can think of you seeing you on our TV?
I take a long walk between about 1:30 and 3:30. Just to clear my head and avoid all of the election day anecdotal reports you're getting that are even more useless than early voting stuff.
All right, Steve Kornacki of NBC News. You can watch him on election night. Thank you so much for joining us. This was wildly informative.
This was fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, man.
Hey, guys. So that was super fun. And I don't know, as a former campaign operative, I can get kind of snobby about talking to people about what they actually are looking at and reading ahead of time, especially reporters who I think don't necessarily know how campaigns judge these things. But man, he's blowing it all away. Steve, what'd you think of his answer on your Liz Cheney, Nikki Haley, Republicans clinching it? I did like his phrase, practicing Republicans. I'm going to borrow that.
I mean, look, I thought it was really interesting. I mean, as you pointed out in the interview, which I don't think anybody would describe as hard hitting. I mean, there was a lot of, there was fangirling and fanboying going on, I think, because he is so smart. It's it is fun to sort of talk to somebody who's kind of obviously at the top of his game.
Yeah.
But I thought I was struck by a couple of things. One, I think he's right about the question on Wisconsin, and in particular on those Nikki Haley, Liz Cheney, January 6th voters. I've been this one of these mythical pieces I've been reporting. That's what I'm spending the last days of the campaign on, is trying to figure out does it matter? Why are they focusing on it the way that they are? And some of this is projection, right? Because I think those voters are me, right? I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump. If I were in Wisconsin, would I vote for Kamala Harris? Would I write somebody in? I think these are the questions that a lot of people are wrestling with in Wisconsin. I've spoken to Wisconsin voters now over the past month who walk me through this. Certainly some people, there are definitely Joe Biden voters in 2020 among movement conservatives, disaffected Republicans, who are saying, I'm not doing it with Kamala. I don't feel comfortable with her. I can't trust her. She's not really made any policy overtures. And the idea that they voted for in 2020 with Joe Biden was that there would be at least the possibility of some return to normalcy. Seems not to be a compelling reason for them to vote for Kamala this time around. On the other hand, I've spoken to Republicans, former Republicans, who are sort of eager to vote for Kamala because they need to lodge their protest once again against Donald Trump. I thought that what he said about watching Hamilton County, Indiana, was really interesting, because while it is the case that Indiana is not going to be competitive in the presidential race, it might be surprisingly competitive in the gubernatorial race, which I think people hadn't necessarily counted on. There are cities in places like Indiana that look like cities or feel like cities elsewhere in the sort of upper Midwest. And to look at Hamilton County in Indiana because of demographic trends that are maybe not mirror exactly, but are at least close to some of the trends that we've seen in places like Ozaukee County, Wisconsin, I think is really smart. And I will now be paying attention to both Hamilton County, Indiana, and Osceola County, Florida, because of what he said.
Jonah, biggest takeaways before we hop into other news of the week.
I just thought you completely dodged my question about who would win in a fight with Harry Anton.
Yeah, that was ridiculous. Harry Anton, by the way, I do have to give a shout out to. He's the guy, like, when I see his byline on something, I read it word for word very slowly because I think he is brilliant on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I have to say, I mean, I think Anton's great. I think Kornacki's great. Basically, like, the polling stuff, the actual people who live and breathe and work on that beat, they're all pretty good. Because I think in part because, first of all, the competition for those slots is intense. And unlike a lot of normal journalism, there are objective metrics that one can apply about whether or not someone is actually good at it. And so you tend to get people who are good at it. And like Nate Cohn, I mean, they all have perfectly intellectually honest caveats about why they're taking the position that they take and why they're looking at the numbers the way they're looking at them. But I do think that Kornacki is about as good as you can get at that stuff, on the big board and all that. I don't blame him for not having an answer about whether or not the swing states are going to move in tandem or move separately. But I kind of suspect I increasingly have a gut feeling that it's not going to be a nail biter. Which doesn't mean it's not going to be close in the popular vote, and it doesn't mean that these polls are wrong. It's just that if they're wrong in anything close to the same direction, when it's this, like, if let's just say for the sake of argument, it's so tied that it's a 1 vote difference between them. Like, you could see all you need is a tiny shift in the wind to make all of those states go one way or almost all those states. I mean, like, I think North Carolina, Vegas, and Georgia are kind of outliers, but like you could see the Rust Belt states going all together for Harris really, really easily. And so I don't know.
To your point,
to
your point, if the polls are wrong, they could be wrong by under 1 point, which would be a polling win. It would mean the polls were incredibly accurate. But if they're all wrong within 1 point in the same direction, this will not have been a close race, because when you win a state by more than 1 percentage point, that's the ball game. There's no recount happening. There's no, coulda, woulda, shoulda.
Thousands of votes
hundreds
that
of
can't be
thousands
made
of
up.
votes.
Yeah,
that's right. So, I think back to 2012, and my job, of course, was to prepare for recounts in whatever it was at that point, 8 states, 10 states. I think Florida was 1.2%. North Carolina was about 1.5%. This was a blowout in that sense in every state. And I don't think people necessarily realize that 1% is the ball game. It's not a close race at that point. What we're really looking for recounts, credible recounts, under 0.5 percentage point. If it's between 0.5 percentage point and 1 percentage point, oftentimes some of the states, they will allow the campaign to pay for a recount, for instance. There's a reason they think of it that way. It's like, look, you're really not going to be able to change it. If it's over 0.5 percentage point, that's still tens and tens of thousands of votes. But if you think something's really, if you just want to sleep better at night, whatever, know what the real number is, like, that's fine. It's the under 0.5 percentage point that we don't really know who won at that point.
Yeah. The other thing that I think he downplayed for the sake of entirely laudable journalistic even-handedness is the difference in bets between these two campaigns. Like, the Trump campaign, I mean, he laid it out, but I just don't think, because he sounds so calm and reassuring, that people really realize what he's saying. is the Trump campaign is making a massive, massive, colossal, epical bet that a bunch of young dudes who've never voted before, even for Trump, are going to turn out so massively that they are going to erase the advantage Harris has with women who have voted before, including in midterms. And if you talk to, I talked to a bunch of Democratic consultant types in the last few days because I've been at CNN so much. And like, if you had to like when you're choosing teams for softball when you're a kid or whatever, I don't mean this pejoratively, but like young 20-something white dudes and really 20-something and 30-something blacks and Hispanics, males, are the kids you'd pick last for your team if you could put together a coalition.
What did that feel like, Jonah?
Picking those kids last, I felt bad about it, but you know.
Did you stand there by yourself, just longing to be picked?
Not only are women higher propensity voters, as you're noting, Jonah, they are more likely to vote. They consider it part of their character and personality to be a voter. They're also more of voters.
Right.
About 52% of the electorate is female, so there's more of them to pick from. Everything about women
They're also
is
wildly
better.
Disproportionately plugged into social networks
They
and
smell
civil
better.
society. So they know how to move other people to vote, you know?
Because they smell better? Yeah.
Partly.
So they're...
Yeah.
But you think about, this is like in all seriousness, Steve, you'll remember this from back in your day when you were young, I suppose.
When they called you Stinky
Back in
Steve?
your day?
Yeah. I mean, when you think about get out the vote efforts back in the 80s when you were in, I don't know, college or something, it was all women, right? That's like the Republican backbone. It was old Republican women who were all the, get out the vote efforts, working the, phone banks and all of that stuff. And that's really shifted as the voter realignment has shifted. I've got a quick one before we go on to garbage trucks and garbage.
Wait, I have another point.
But hold on. I have a question for you. Do y'all think that I think the voter realignment around education is real and permanent for Republicans and Democrats. I am not at all convinced that the gender realignment is real and permanent between Republicans and Democrats. I think that it will be very hard for a 2028 Republican candidate for president, whoever it is, to appeal to male voters in the same way that Trump does. I mean, just like literally run through some names, and I think you'll see the problem quite quickly. Do y'all think the gender gap is an actual permanent fixture in politics or a 2024 Trump fixture?
I mean, it's an extension of something that we'd already seen, right? The gender gap isn't new right now. It wasn't new in 2020.
Yes.
It wasn't new in 2016. So it's an extension. I mean, it's accelerated. It's bigger than.
I mean, I remember the George H.W. Bush cover of what was Time and Newsweek, the Wimp Factor, right? It's been a thing for a while. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Of course you do, because you're so old, as Sarah did not point out in your case. No, I think I actually buy your analysis on that. I think the shift in education is much more likely to be enduring than the kind of shift we've seen on the gender question. Let me go back to Jonah's point real quickly, though, because I think he's right that the Trump campaign is making this sort of epochal bet on these young males. They're not doing it without reason. If you talk to people sort of in and around Trump world, Republican consultants who have worked on these races over the past 6-8 years, particularly 2020, 2022, and are working on this one, there are stories, particularly in Republican primaries, of this sort of hidden young male vote just kind of popping up magically out of nowhere to win primaries in some cases for people who have backed Donald Trump. So I think now it's entirely possible that this might not be as widespread as the Trump campaign thinks it is, that it may not be as powerful as the Trump campaign thinks it is. But I don't think it's just a sort of random like stab. It is, they're looking at things that they've seen over the past couple of cycles and saying, this is a place that we can plus up our vote. At the same time, I think that it's also the case, and there's been a lot of sort of mocking speculation about this, that Democrats going after this sort of secret female vote, women who don't want to tell their husbands that they're supporting Donald Trump, that they didn't come up with that out of thin air either. I think that there are specific anecdotes and specific patterns where they have seen this. Either canvassers who are out door knocking have gotten these kinds of responses, or they've seen certain indications in early vote totals that suggest that this might be gettable. But I don't think you're seeing them make that play based on a hunch. They're looking at things. Now, they may be wrong. They might be wrong. It might not be as important as they seem to think it is. But I think they're seeing things or hearing anecdotes that support that kind of an approach.
Would you lie to your spouse about who you voted for?
I don't lie to my spouse.
Do you think she would ever lie to you about who she voted for?
I don't think so.
Jonah, would Jessica lie to you about who she voted for?
No, she'd accuse me of lying, but she would. There's no way she would lie to me. She would she would harangue me about who to vote for. But we actually had quite a long conversation last night about all the different scenarios of what would be better for us, the country, the dispatch, conservatism, and we went through every scenario, and it was pretty depressing. But
I feel very confident in my what is best for the country, because I think it's realistic. Like, basically, I want divided government. I think that's what's best for the country. I don't think there's a realistic scenario where Trump wins the White House and Democrats take the Senate and the House. That's not going to happen.
Right.
But it is a realistic scenario for Harris to take the White House and Republicans to take the Senate and the House. And I think that could actually force both sides to the table, potentially. Whereas I think if, for instance, Harris won the presidency, Republicans won the Senate, and Democrats got the House back, I actually think it would just continue to be miserable for 2 years, and they would wait it out for a more favorable Senate map and see if they could get the Senate in 2026 rather than compromise with Republicans. I think she'd be under a lot of pressure not to work with Republican senators at that point. They'd just wait for judges. They'd wait on any legislative stuff because the map is better for Democrats in 2026 in the Senate. Anyone have a different take on sort of the best for the country scenario that you'd like? It's realistic, right?
Realistic?
Like, yeah, no, the sweet meteor of death isn't coming. We would know by now, you know?
Yeah. Unless NORAD's really fallen down on the job.
Let's talk garbage. It is wild to me that the closing statements this election cycle were the October surprise, in the sense that they stepped on their own closing statement so badly with their surrogates that all we're talking about is how the reverse of their closing statements. So Trump goes to Madison Square Garden trying to make a pitch for, as you say, I mean, largely men or a masculine victory for America, and has a comedian who tells a joke that's not all that clever about how there's a large floating garbage pile out in the ocean and it's Puerto Rico. And it totally steps on Trump's message. The one thing that men don't like, I mean, I think there's a lot of things y'all don't like, but generally speaking, it's to be mocked and belittled, right? So really unhelpful for Trump. He had to distance himself from that comment, which Trump never does, which should tell you how potentially damaging they thought that was. So you would think someone would have learned something, as the Harris campaign is gleefully celebrating about this unforced error from the Trump campaign. So she gives her closing statement. It has her to-do list about how she'll be a president for all Americans, about how Trump has an enemies list, but she has a to-do list. And then Joe Biden gives a nothing burger Zoom call with Voto Latino that is meandering and not very easy to understand, where he says, speaking about the Trump error, the only garbage I see are Trump supporters. The White House tries to claim there's an apostrophe there, that he meant Trump supporters joke. Yada, yada, yada.
The Trump supporters, singular, joke, right? That was
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the controversy. Yeah.
Replace supporter with the name of the comedian, and that's the claim that they're making.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Fine. I won't tell people what they should think about whether that was accurate or what he meant or what he didn't mean, but it's now consumed. This closing statement period, so much so that Trump then shows up in a garbage truck driving around and a little, caution vest or whatever at his rally. They're trying to make hay out of it. I guess this goes to my point about the vibes election, Steve. I know you don't like it. The policies aren't that different. And now I'm going to argue that even the vibes aren't that different. There's a reason that both sides jumped on the other's error, because it's so easy for voters to believe that the other team hates them, really despises them and loathes them. So it's not surprising to Democrats that Trump thinks Puerto Ricans are garbage. And it's not surprising to Republicans that Harris, Biden, etc., think of them as garbage. That's a sad place to be.
Yeah, it is a sad place to be, and it's not a surprising place to be, right? I mean, we've sort of seen whatever this thing was at the end of this campaign. We knew it was going to be something dispiriting and discouraging like this, right? I mean, it wasn't going to be like we had a final discussion on the role of America in the world, and that was going to be the thing that determined the election. It was going to be something stupid like this, and it was sort of obvious. I have to say, I mean, so on the comment itself, it's interesting. I think this was one sort of rare moment where Jonah and I really saw things differently, or I came to this. I heard that one way, and Jonah heard it. Jonah was more open-minded than I am. I think it's almost indisputable that Biden was saying that he found Trump supporters garbage. The only way you can suggest that he was actually talking about the comedian is if you think he was reading something and just misread it. But even that doesn't make sense to me. It seems very obvious. And I thought it was sort of revealing how many journalists immediately went into spin mode for Joe Biden at that moment. As I say, I leave open the possibility, small one though I think it is, that he misread it and therefore he didn't mean it as it very clearly sounded to me. But I think the easiest explanation is like he was calling Trump supporters garbage. I think this could matter. It's easy, at the end of these campaigns where, you're in the sort of flinging poo stage of our modern political contests to shrug it all off and say that it doesn't matter. I think in some respects this could matter. What Kamala Harris has spent time doing, trying to reach out to these disaffected Republicans, and there's no question that was not just sort of part of her strategy over the past 6 weeks, but at the heart of her strategy over the past 6 weeks. She is trying to appeal to those people. It's why she gave the speech she gave at the Ellipse. It's why she gave a relatively conciliatory speech at the Democratic National Convention. It's why she spent a bunch of time with Liz Cheney. It's why they've activated these Republicans for Harris groups. They think that a key part to their victory is getting these disaffected Republicans to cast a ballot for Kamala Harris affirmatively. And I think what a lot of these Republicans were looking for is, hey, can you tell me something that gives me some assurance that you won't just be a continuation of Joe Biden, that you won't make promises that you're returning things to normal, you won't be divisive, and then talk about Jim Crow 2.0 and really not fulfill those promises. And I think she's gone more or less out of her way to offer reassurances that she won't do that. But when it comes to specifics, there isn't much. I was watching a video of this guy I spent time with for this Wisconsin piece I'm doing, Sean Riley, who's the mayor of Waukesha, Wisconsin, longtime Republican, quit the party on January 6th because he was so frustrated with what happened on January 6th. He's still the serving mayor of Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is at the heart of this red county that we've been talking about. He did an appearance with Tim Walz, and Sean Riley, the mayor of Waukesha, gets up and says, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Donald Trump is terrible. The way he's taken the Republican Party is awful. January 6th was really bad, and sort of makes this case, and then turns it over to Tim Walz. And Walz then says, thanks, Mayor Riley. We agree. January 6th was bad. Donald Trump was bad. And here are the specific policy reasons you should vote for me and Kamala Harris. And, goes into policies that will undoubtedly excite the Democratic base. I think if you're a Republican listening to that and you're looking for those assurances that you will have a seat at the table, that there might be some compromise, you hear that and you say, boy, this sounds just like the kind of boilerplate Democratic policies in the past.
Yep. I mean, this is why I think Walz, in hindsight, look, if Harris loses, I really believe that the blame has to fall with Joe Biden for deciding to run again and then having to drop out. Democrats not being able to have a primary where I don't think they would have picked Harris, but if nothing else, it would have given them a year to sort of sand out some rough edges, actually vet vice presidential candidates, all of that. But even short of that, if you want to look at the more micro strategic decisions, picking Walz was, I think, a huge mistake because he's completely unable to shift strategies if they needed to shift strategies, like wanting to reach the not practicing Republicans, to borrow Kornacki's phrase. And this is such a good example, but he's done it over and over again. Like when he went on the Daily Show and he's asked about Liz-Cheney, and he basically giggles and is like, don't worry, she won't have anything to do with our administration.
Yeah.
Well, that totally undermines the whole point of doing these events. He only speaks far left-wing progressive, unlike a Shapiro. I mean, it's just stunning she didn't pick Shapiro. Shapiro is very fluent in many languages, including conservative. I don't say that about a lot of elected Democrats. In fact, I'm hard-pressed to think of more than one or two others who I think actually can speak fluent conservative, but he's one of them. And then it turns out she needed someone who could. No shock there. Jonah, thoughts, feelings about garbage? Do you like garbage?
Steve outrageously accused me of being more open-minded and fair-minded than him, and I need to respond to that.
Yeah.
I will say, my initial response on Twitter was not following my own advice of don't respond immediately to these kinds of things. I was trying to make the point, and I did it badly, that this will be a blue dress, gold dress kind of thing, where if you're inclined to think well of him, you're just going to... First of all, let's be clear. He comes across in that thing as,
incoherent
and unfit to be president.
He should not be president.
He's a mess, right? And so I kind of grade people on how they talk when they're slurring their words and pretty incoherent, a little, maybe too generously. Maybe Steve is right. I'm just a big-hearted, nice guy, and I shouldn't be. That said, I have some other disagreements on all of this stuff. And I've always said it's perfectly fair to read him as saying, because it's plain text of what he says is what he says. And what he says is the Trump supporters are garbage. But I think this matters not a bit in terms of moving voters, getting voters to change a vote. I think it is very useful for Trump for get out the vote. That the kind of dude bros who feel like men are looked down upon in our society and the, forgotten man, who are you calling garbage, right? That kind of helps for motivating votes. I suspect, and I'm not staking out a bold claim here or making a bet, but if I had to bet, I would argue that calling the Puerto Ricans, Puerto Rico a garbage island, is more likely to move votes that matter. This thing is like, and let's take a step back just for 2 seconds. Calling people, just all things being equal, calling an ethnicity garbage is different than calling people who support a person that you think is unfit to be president, who you think kind of stole an election. You shouldn't say it. You shouldn't paint with that kind of broad brush. But like, it's like the difference between saying these immigrants are poisoning the blood of America simply by virtue of being the wrong ethnicity versus saying the Trumpists are poisoning the minds of America because of their horrible rhetoric. I mean, I just think they're different things.
Well, can
All
I
that
also
said-
add on that? Like, this is what makes, I think, y'all's argument about what Biden meant, that he meant Trump supporters are garbage. If you believe that Trump is Hitler, then I guess I'm confused why you're now
wouldn't call him
pushing
garbage.
back on the idea that people who support Hitler aren't garbage. Like,
Right.
don't you think people who support Hitler are garbage? I tend to. So if then Trump is Hitler, I mean, I took the LSAT a long time ago, but it feels like a pretty easy logic game to me.
Yeah, but so this gets to the point I've been trying to make for a while now, that is at the heart of so much of this garbage, so to speak, is that everyone works from the assumption that they see Trump, that other people see Trump the exact same way they do. So if you see a fascist and then you hear people saying nice things about him, you say, "Oh, you must think you must think fascists are nice," but they don't see him as a fascist,
Correct.
right? And so,
but this is the Democrats, the very Biden and Harris, who are saying Trump is a Nazi, that saying Trump is Hitler, then accidentally, or, you know, say the line about the Trump supporters being garbage, and they're like, no, that's obviously not what we meant. How could you think we meant that? And it's like, well,
right.
because
there's a serious tension there. I grant you that. But anyway, back to the Puerto Rico thing. It is going very viral. It's not getting it's getting some coverage, but it's going very viral in like Allentown, which is a huge Puerto Rican population. All the Spanish language radio stations there, the big Spanish language radio stations there, are run by Puerto Ricans. The DJs have been going nuts on it. The sort of Spanish language Puerto Rican Instagram with Jennifer Lopez and Bad Bunny, who's got some new name now, and I didn't even know who Bad Bunny was a week ago. They're going crazy about it. And those voters are late voters because they're really not politically engaged. And the idea that in a state that could come down to a difference of 5,000 or 10,000 votes, that you're going to piss off a specific ethnic group that is essentially a swing vote, that could actually matter in a way that calling people, generically saying Trump supporters are garbage does not move anybody. I do think that
right, if one side, this is my point about the only two ways you win elections, you get people to vote who weren't going to vote, or you change someone's vote from one candidate to another. Right. The changing votes is worth 2 in some sense. The getting someone to vote is worth 1. So the garbage comment is worth 1. It's a turnout mechanism. The Puerto Rico comment could be a 1 because it could mean they stay home when they were going to vote. Or it could actually change votes, in which case it's worth 2, which makes it different.
Yeah.
Yeah, although I didn't finish my argument, even though I went on for quite a long time. Part of the reason I think the garbage quote. I mean, look, Nick had a very good newsletter about this yesterday. On the surface, it's absurd. Like, Trump has been calling Kamala and her supporters garbage for months and saying things that are much worse.
All sorts of things.
All of this stuff, and the sort of pearl clutching by Trump supporters over this is totally preposterous. But they see an advantage. I think the reason and it was Joe Biden who said garbage, not Kamala Harris. The reason that it could have an effect is because she has made this effort to convince these disaffected R's that they can sort of trust her. Like, hey, you'll have a seat at the table. I will listen to you. Look at me. I'm being nice to Liz-Cheney. I'm touring. I've got Jeff Flake, senator from Arizona, former senator from Arizona, doing events for me.
Here's what they really
trust
think
me
about
to do
you.
these things.
Yeah.
And then it's like, here's what they really think about you. Now, she, sort of somewhat distanced herself from Biden the next day, but it was sort of like, he clarified, and I meant what I said, and it was in a minute by minute news cycle. It was 12-15 hours later. I think she had an opening to come out that night and say, hey, wait a second, we shouldn't be calling each other garbage, and I just gave this entire speech premised on that fact. And I love Joe Biden for picking me as his running mate, for allowing me to serve. I'm honored. He's served well. Say whatever you want about Joe Biden, and then say, but he's just flat wrong. And we're never going to get beyond this moment. if we keep doing the kinds of things that my boss, Joe Biden, just did. And, Sister Soldier moments can be overrated, but that would have been one. And
no,
I think it
I
could
made
have
the
been a
same point
pretty
on CNN
effective
yesterday
one.
that this was actually a gift from Biden in a certain way. I mean, it's not a gift they
Right.
wanted that stepped on their message, but like, here was an opportunity to say, look, first of all, and look, one of the things about the way she distanced herself really bothers me, where she says, I don't think you should criticize people for how they vote. Sure, you can criticize people for how they vote. You shouldn't call them garbage, right? There's a difference
Right.
between like demonization and dehumanization and civic discourse disagreement. And so she should have, like, the phrase should have been, I don't believe in dehumanizing people or demonizing people because of how they vote. But of course, we can disagree about how to vote. That's what elections are all about. I cannot tell you how much I resent being put into like wordsmith for politicians mode with these people, but they're so bad at it. That said, she should have just said, she should have done some big, look, I love Joe. I personally don't think he meant what it sounds like he said, but I can understand why people would be angry about it. But that's the politics, whether he meant it or not, that's the politics of the past. That's the kind of politics I'm trying to get out of, that I'm trying to move this country beyond, where we don't call people garbage or scum like Donald Trump has done, and then list all the things that Donald Trump has said as, evidence to show the hypocrisy of all of this pearl clutching from, Fox types. I mean, Daily Show ran a clip of all of these Fox hosts talking about, with, more in sorrow than in anger, but it really sounds like Joe Biden really does think half this country is garbage and he's demonizing people and he's using the language of hate. I mean, like over and over and over again. And then they would cut to Trump saying, the Democrats are scum. They're the worst form of scum. They're vile. They're criminals. Frankly, they don't deserve to live. Like all this kind of stuff. And then they cut back to another Fox host saying, I'm really disturbed by this kind of troubling rhetoric from Joe Biden. I mean, like, I have a hard time. This is such an unbelievably stupid moment that we're in right now. And I agree with you entirely. It's not even Tom Wolfish. It's like Pilgrim's Progress allegory time, where the election is ending on the theme of garbage. It's so on the nose that it kind of makes me feel like the writer's room is just screwing with us.
All right, well, this is our last dispatch pod before the election. Do y'all have any predictions to make? It doesn't have to be who will win, but I'm sure listeners would like to know what you think about that. I'll go first, which is there's different ways to judge the end of a campaign, and I think I've talked about this a lot when I mentioned 2016. When I mentioned 2016, and I thought Clinton would win until about the Friday before the election, when you're listening to this probably, because of a few things. One, she went to Michigan, and I just thought, oh my goodness, her internal polling, like, you would never go to Michigan at this point. Time is your most valuable resource. She's not just like up by a point in Michigan. They must have her down in Michigan, which is wild. And I was like, ruh-roh. But also a story that I saw this one line in, and it talked about how the Clinton staffers weren't hooking up with each other. And I really believe that there is a whole other metric that you can gauge which campaign is winning based on fun, and hooking up is fun. I don't know who is having the Randy good time on any campaigns right now, but it does appear to me that the Trump team is having more fun in these closing days than the Harris team. And that, it doesn't tell you who, they don't know more than we know necessarily, but that fact is usually pretty predictive. So that's where I am right now. What prediction do you guys have?
I predict that a lot of people are going to be unhappy when we know the results of the election.
True.
I think we sort of covered my thing earlier in the conversation with Steve, and then again earlier. I mean, it's entirely possible that this election is going to end up being as close as the polling has suggested it's going to be for the past several months. I think it's also possible, because of the underlying volatility in our politics that we've seen since 2006, because of the massive realignment that's taking place, that we are in the middle of, that we're witnessing, the distaste for the candidates, the gap in enthusiasm. There are all sorts of reasons that we could use post facto to explain why it ended up not being as close as we had anticipated or as the polling had suggested. And I think people should be open to that possibility. The other thing I'll say is, in the lead up to 2020, we saw Donald Trump and his team not very subtly telegraph that they were going to say the election, that he won no matter what he said. You had Steve Bannon saying that in public before the vote, several days before the vote, that Donald Trump's plan was to go on television that night when he was likely to be leading because of election day in-person voting and declare victory, and that he was going to use that to try to remain in office. And of course, thanks to the work of the January 6th committee and the mostly Republicans who testified before it, we now know exactly how elaborate that plan was, and what they did between election day and January 6th to try to keep Donald Trump in office. I would say what we're seeing now this year makes me even more concerned if Kamala Harris does in fact beat Donald Trump, because Trump didn't sort of come up with this plan and try to implement it starting in July. This has been the core of his message for years. His argument has been, if I lose, they stole it. And every part of his campaign has been built around that fact. Even his get out the vote operation, they call it too big to rig, make it too big to rig. You're seeing them. I mean, Donald Trump is now, we're recording this Thursday morning, has been for the last several days pretty regularly tweeting claims about voter fraud that are not true. You're seeing his people in Trump world amplifying those claims, coming up with those claims, I think in some cases inventing those claims. And you're also seeing people, this happened at the Madison Square Garden rally that we talked about earlier, try to create a sense of inevitability about a Trump victory. And this is what Tucker Carlson said. He's obviously going to win. He's so obviously more popular than she is. She's this failed politician. In effect, the only way that he could lose is if it's stolen. If she wins, I think we can expect that to be a match on dry kindling. And I really worry about what that means.
Last word, you, Jonah.
I'll give the more optimistic take on that, and then make a better prediction. I agree it's going to be bad. If Harris wins, there'll be some violence. There'll be some ugliness. But Trump's not president of the United States. And a big chunk of his ability to create a January 6th was because he was actually in the White House at the time. And the things that made the January 6th strategy, the John Eastman garbage strategy, possible have been largely fixed in law. So, like, if the results come in and Trump loses, I agree with you, there's going to be all sorts of ugliness, or there is a high probability that there'll be ugliness, but there is no victory strategy to it, right? It is more tantrum than trying to steal an election. There's just simply no way, if the results are clear, Trump can actually overturn the results of the election. I don't think he really could have on January 6th, but because he was president, there were means at his disposal where he could give it a shot, right? And he almost got, all these electors sent back and blah, 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 and who knows, and he was going to press the chaos going further. And that's what was so, I just don't think he can do that this time. And so then if he loses, does Elon Musk say, holy crap, I got to get out of this position? And does he lose support from some people who really just don't need that kind of ugliness? Tucker is incentivized because he is trying to maintain credibility with this alienated mass audience for a long time after Trump. And being on their side about the stolen election stuff is in his business interest, to be like sort of William Jennings Bryan of jackasses. And so that's a different thing. So, yeah, I think there can be violence, but I don't think there's a chance that the election will be overturned. And because there's no chance for that, the more capable stakeholders in the Trump BS apparatus probably will jump ship pretty early. Like, I don't think Lindsey Graham and all those people, the reason why Lindsey Graham is a useful bellwether in these kinds of things is because he is such a craven coward, and he will go where his own longevity in politics needs him to be. And so the idea that he is going to back a ship that cannot help but sink, there are going to be a lot of those kind of people who are just going to be like, hey, Trump gave it a shot, he lost. And there'll be tantrums and there'll be people firebombing polling stations and terrible stuff. And that stuff should be put down with an iron fist within the confines of the rule of law. But I'm less worried about how bad it could be than you are. In terms of my predictions, I think it's going to be an earlier night than people think, one way or the other. I'm not saying that it's going to be all the polling error is in one direction or not, but I think even if the polling errors if some of the polls are wrong favorable to Trump and some of the polls are wrong favorable to Harris, if you average them, you still get an error. And it's not going to be zero. It's going to be like 1 or 2 points one way or 1 or 2 points the other way. And that will be enough to be decisive in a whole bunch of places. So that I think by Wednesday morning, we're in pretty good shape for knowing who won.
And with that, for Dispatch members, we'll see you on election night, and everyone else will talk to you when we may or may not know something, but the ballots will be cast. Happy voting.